Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time I talked about Jeb's life from his time at Fort Leavenworth to Virginia's secession, and Stuart's promotion to lieutenant colonel in the Provisional Army of Virginia. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Stuart's first assignment was at Harper's Ferry, reporting to Colonel Thomas Jonathan Jackson. Before going to Harper's Ferry, he found out that the United States government had promoted him to captain, but he was out of that army now and embarking on a career in a new army. One of Stuart's biographers summed up Jeb's placement in the Army of Virginia when he wrote, "Virginia and Stuart were within the Southern fold. Moreover, this new nation was at war, and Stuart had spent more than a third of his life acquiring precisely the skills and credentials his new country needed most. He had spent 4 years of intense study and training at West Point. Then for the last 7 years he had gained varieties of experience on active duty. He had joined a brand new army and advanced from lieutenant to lieutenant colonel overnight. Stuart's opportunities seemed limitless. Most of his young life had been a conscious struggle to make good. Here was the wonderful chance for conspicuous success." Stuart arrived at Harper's Ferry on May 10th. Jeb gravitated to his new superior. Jackson liked Jeb as well, even ignoring the fact that Stuart's commission was in the infantry and gave him control of the cavalry companies under his command, since Stuart possessed great experience with the cavalry. This angered Turner Ashby, who sought that position, so Jackson split his cavalry companies, giving Stuart one regiment and Ashby the other, then separating the two, with Ashby patrolling the Potomac River. Ashby wasn't the only one who took offense at Stuart's rise in rank. William E. Jones, also known as Grumble Jones, was a West Point trained soldier and possessed experience, yet Stuart outranked the older Jones. Jones wouldn't forgive Stuart for his superiority in rank. When Joseph E. Johnston arrived at Harper's Ferry a few weeks after Stuart, he took command of all the forces there in the name of the Confederate Army, superseding and taking control of Virginia's army. Johnston withdrew his forces from that border area to Winchester, Virginia. A Federal army was located just a few miles away at Martinsburg. Stuart situated his camp halfway between the two armies at Bunker Hill to monitor the Federal movements. Cavalry units came to Stuart's camp, new recruits who had never seen battle before or heard shots fired in anger. Jeb needed to train these men in the ways of war and cavalry tactics. He believed that the best way to learn was to do. He spent less time on formation and more time acclimating his men to combat. Brand new recruits were taken on raids through and behind enemy lines. On numerous occasions, Stuart's band of horsemen would be surrounded on 3 sides, and he told them they may have to cut their way out. But Stuart always found his way out of harm's way, threading the needle on many occasions. When the Union Army located at Martinsburg moved toward Winchester, Stuart used the inexperienced Federal troops as a tool to teach his troops. He put out a skirmish line, and when Union soldiers got to within about 200 yards, he pulled his men back slowly, walking on foot. When the Federals halted, he brought many of his men around him and said, "Now I want to talk to you men. You are brave fellows, and patriotic ones too, but you are ignorant of this kind of work, and I am teaching you. I want you to observe that a good man on a good horse can never be caught. Another thing, cavalry can trot away from anything, and a gallop is a gait unbecoming a soldier, unless he is going toward the enemy. Remember that we gallop toward the enemy and trot away always." About that time, an artillery shell whizzed high over the men's heads. Stuart's eyes flashed with excitement. "There, I've been waiting for that and watching those fellows. I knew they'd shoot too high, and I wanted you to hear how shells sound." Stuart got his men used to the sound of battle without putting them in danger, and also taught them the range of weaponry so they knew when to take cover. Most soldiers learned marching formations, but Stuart taught combat. The new recruits initially thought their new commander a fool, but after his combat training, they declared him some weird genius. Through Stuart's classes, it's arguable to say that Stuart's horsemen were the best trained and most experienced soldiers as a group when the first major battles erupted. Stuart and his cavalry, which numbered not even 350 men, monitored a 50-mile front for Johnston and his army. Johnston trusted Stuart, and when Johnston would later go west, he wrote to Stuart and said, "How can I eat, sleep, or rest in peace without you upon the outpost?" On one of Stuart's scouting missions, he came upon a group of Union soldiers near a fence. Wearing a blue uniform, Stuart approached the Federals and ordered them to dismantle the fence so his cavalry could come through. Once the Federal soldiers took down the fence, Stuart pulled out his pistol and told them to throw down their weapons. They were now his prisoners, 46 of them in all. Jeb's troopers came riding up and took the men into captivity. However, 3 of them tried to resist and lost their lives because of it. In mid-July 1861, Johnston needed to extricate himself and his army from the Shenandoah Valley and meet Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard near Manassas Junction, where a much larger Union force was advancing from Washington, D.C. Stuart screened Johnston's movements, preventing the Union Army at Martinsburg from discovering that Johnston had left. That Federal Army didn't know that the Confederates were out of their front until July 20th, when all of Johnston's army was at Manassas. Once Johnston was safely on his way, Stuart and his horsemen rode east, arriving at Manassas on July 20th. As the First Battle of Manassas erupted, Stuart was forced to pace and wait until ordered to go forward. Several times he rode to Beauregard, informed him that he and his men were ready for service when needed, then rode back to wait and pace about. For most of the day, Stuart worried he would miss out on the battle, as cannons roared and muskets cracked in the distance. Finally, at 2 p.m., a messenger arrived saying, "Colonel Stuart, General Beauregard directs that you bring your command into action at once, and that you attack where the firing is hottest." The horsemen rode toward the battle. The route took them through an outdoor field hospital, where men lay dying and horribly mangled from battle. Surgeons removed limbs, and the cavalrymen attempted to look away, but the sight caused them to throw up on their way to battle. As they arrived at the scene of battle, they saw a unit wavering, dressed in red pants, blue jackets, red hats, and white gaiters. Thinking they were Confederate Zouaves, they called out, "Don't run, boys, we are here." Then Stuart noticed the flag, the stars and stripes. Jeb quickly ordered a charge. At 30 yards away, the Zouaves released a volley of musketry. The wall of flame hit the rebel horsemen, but Stuart thundered on. The Zouaves attempted to load their guns as the horsemen got closer, but before they could, Stuart smashed into the Zouaves' ranks. The rebel horsemen slashed and shot their way through the Northerners. Then Jeb reformed his men in the woods and then proceeded over to the left of the Confederate line to protect an artillery battery. From there he could see the whole battle unfold, and he sent messages to the infantry commanders letting them know what was developing. At 4 p.m., Stuart and the artillery battery accompanied Jubal Early's brigade in the advance to push the Union forces off the field. As the Federal troops ran toward Washington, Stuart sent a message to Beauregard asking for permission to pursue. But before he got any word back, he realized that he needed no permission to perform the obvious and set out after the Federals. He captured so many men and detailed so many of his troopers to escort his prisoners back to their lines that after only a short distance, he had too few troopers to pursue the enemy. His advance stopped near Sudley Church, and he made his headquarters at a local farmhouse. Writing to Flora after the battle, he wrote, "I am your own darling husband, whose thoughts and affection are centered in his own dear Flora, and even in the fiercest of fire of the battlefield, I thought of her, and how proud she would be to see the conduct of her husband. The papers have said very little about my regiment, but the generals have said a great deal. You need not be surprised to see your hubby a brigadier. I have been in one real battle now, and feel sure I can command better than many I saw." When Stuart discovered that the Confederate Army would not advance on Washington after the victory at First Bull Run, he moved his command to Fairfax Courthouse and set up outposts to detect enemy movement and screen the actions of the Confederate Army of the Potomac under Johnston. Jeb conducted these outpost operations superbly. A non-commissioned officer and 4 to 6 men made up an outpost guarding a designated area. Those outposts laid about half a mile from the company headquarters. 200 yards in front of the outpost was a single man called a vidette. It was his responsibility to fire his weapon when the enemy was spotted. Then the men on the outpost and the company that was a half mile away would ride to the scene of the action. The men on the outpost would change every 4 hours to prevent fatigue and exhaustion. In this way, Stuart protected the Confederate Army from surprise attacks, placing outposts all around the army. Even though there were supposed to be a change in the guards every 4 hours, some companies were placed on outpost duty for sometimes days on end, but such was the situation when Stuart's command was so small. When Stuart rode to one of his outposts, one of his soldiers told him about not having enough provisions and being tired. Stuart responded, "Oh, nonsense. You don't look starved. There's a cornfield over there. Jump the fence and get you a good breakfast. You don't want to go back to camp, I know. It's stupid there, and all the fun is out here. I never go to camp if I can help it." Stuart took part in the soldiers' plot. He patrolled between outposts himself, and one of his troopers claimed that Stuart didn't return to his camp for an entire month at one time, preferring to stay at the outposts. Another soldier wrote to his wife that Stuart sleeps every night on Munson's Hill without even a blanket under or over him, never resting, always vigilant, always active. One soldier recalled, "From personal experience and observation of General Stuart, as well as from the testimony of others, I am disposed to think that he contributed to every man qualities and tastes like his own. Insensible to fatigue himself, he seemed never to understand how a well man could want rest, and as for hardship, there was nothing in his view which a man ought to enjoy quite so heartily except danger." Stuart believed that weariness of one soldier would rub off on others, so the tired, sick, and slightly injured men and horses were sent to a separate camp called the Cripple Company, or Company Q. During his time at Fairfax Courthouse, he met Antonia J. Ford, a woman of Southern loyalty. He and his staff met with her, and Stuart liked her company so much that he made her an honorary aide-de-camp to himself, and he even drew up a mock commission for her. Over a year later, Antonia was detained by Union officers on the suspicion of being a Southern spy, and that commission was found. The joke got her a few months in the old Capitol Prison in Washington. On September 11th, the Federals made a reconnaissance and force toward Louisville with 2,000 soldiers. Stuart's outpost alerted him of the danger, and he set off with about 300 infantry, an artillery battery, and 2 companies of horsemen to confront the enemy. He positioned and instructed the infantry to fire on the Union artillery battery, used his own artillery to scatter the Union infantry, and kept his cavalry in reserve to use in the case of a retreat. Stuart didn't lose a single man and caused a handful of casualties on the Union side. The Federal force was already withdrawn when Stuart got there, but he hastened their withdrawal with his pressure. When Stuart reestablished his outpost, he found a message attached to a tree that a Union officer left. It was from Orlando Poe, someone Stuart had known since his time at West Point. It was addressed to "My Dear Beauty." Said he hated to not have seen Stuart, but invited the Confederate cavalrymen to dinner at the Willard Hotel in Washington on Saturday. Stuart didn't respond, just laughed, and wrote his own message at the bottom of the letter saying that Poe may have seen him had he stopped long enough in his retreat to look back. Stuart wrote a report of the action and his time at the outposts to his immediate superior, who was James Longstreet. Longstreet then wrote to Generals Johnston and Beauregard that Colonel Stuart has been at Munson's Hill since its occupation by our troops. He has been most untiring in the discharge of his duties at that and other advanced positions. Colonel Stuart has, I think, fairly won his claim to brigadier, and I hope the commanding general will unite with me in recommending him for that promotion. Johnston and Beauregard endorsed the promotion, writing, "We think with Brigadier General Longstreet that Colonel Stuart's laborious and valuable services, unintermitted since the war began on this frontier, entitle him to a brigadier generalcy. His calm and daring courage, sagacity, zeal, and activity qualify him admirably for the command of our 3 regiments of cavalry, by which the outpost duty of the army is performed. The government would gain greatly by promoting him." Before Longstreet's endorsement, Johnston wrote to Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, that Stuart is a rare man, wonderfully endowed by nature with the qualities necessary for an officer of light cavalry. Calm, firm, acute, active, and enterprising. I know of no one more competent than he to estimate the accuracies before him at their true value. If you add to this army a real brigade of cavalry, you can find no better brigadier general to command it. Stuart's name was becoming widely known throughout the South and the North, but especially the South, thanks in large part to his unofficial publicist and cousin-in-law, John Eston Cook, who wrote articles about him in papers, including the Charleston Courier. In it, Cook described Jeb as the most hated and feared man by Yankees, and compared him to Garibaldi in Italy. He also thought that Stuart's proud, untainted name would be found in the temple of Southern freedom. On September 26th, Stuart got promoted to the rank of brigadier general. Stuart now made his headquarters halfway between Fairfax Courthouse and Centerville. Johnston, his army commander, gave him control of the entire cavalry arm of the army, and Jeb would use it to his best ability. One of his biographers described Stuart's headquarters as a medieval camp. The young general, just 28 years old, loved music, so you could find musicians, both black and white, constantly in and around Stuart's headquarters building, playing music as Stuart asked. Jeb also recruited what one biographer called freaks to his headquarters, unusual individuals like Corporal Hagan, a giant of a man whose beard grew nearly to his eyes and possessed a thunderous voice. A regular to Stuart's headquarters was a young lawyer from southwest Virginia named John Singleton Mosby. Although just a private, Jeb was drawn to him and requested that Mosby dine with the officers. Soon Mosby would become one of Stuart's most trusted cavalrymen. John Pelham, the well-born Alabamian, took command of Stuart's horse artillery. Pelham resigned from West Point in his first year to join the Confederate Army, and he and Stuart grew ever close during the war. Fitzhugh Lee knew Stuart from their West Point days, becoming friends there and picking up on their friendship when they both joined the Confederate Army. Lee soon became one of Stuart's most trusted subordinates. One day, John Eston Cook, Jeb's unofficial publicist, came to his headquarters and found a Blakely gun in front of the building. That type of weapon was a rifled cannon imported from England, and tethered to that cannon was a huge raccoon that snarled and snapped at anyone who got close to the gun that wasn't his owner. Cook then came to the house where Stuart was and found two ladies there, one young and one older. Both were suspected of being spies. This wasn't the first time that Stuart had to arrest a woman, but he was always kind to his female captives. As he sat at a desk writing out a report, he called for music to be played. 3 black men entered with instruments and began playing tunes. One of them was Bob, technically owned by Stuart, since he was borrowed from his family at Laurel Hill. Just because he amused his suspected spies didn't mean that he didn't fulfill his duty to find spies. He asked if the ladies were amused. They said yes. Then Stuart asked if they would like to see something else of interest. They agreed that they would. Jeb's smile went away, and he pointed to a blood-stained jacket and other garments hanging on the wall. The ladies inquired what that was, and Stuart relayed the story that that was the uniform of one of his soldiers who was shot on picket duty near Fairfax Courthouse. He was saving the clothes to send to the young man's mother. Jeb's serious tone hammered home the seriousness with which he took the protection of his soldiers fighting on the front line, and how he felt about spies who tried to give the enemy information about his troops. Later, the ladies were escorted to a carriage that would take them to Army headquarters. Before they left, Stuart bade them farewell and kissed the hand of the younger woman. Cook asked him why he didn't kiss the older woman's hand, and Jeb whispered, because the old lady's hand had a glove upon it. The general then laughed. In this down period for the Army, although Stuart's part in the military operations was always busy, Flora came to visit with her husband, but the nature of war prevented her from staying long. By the end of 1861, Jeb needed to discuss something with Flora. Her father, Philip St. George Cook, decided to stay loyal to the United States. Cook would state that he owed Virginia nothing, but owed the United States much. Jeb told his wife, "For our own and our children's sake, let us determine to act well our parts and bear with the mistakes and errors of others, but by no means attempt justification of what must be condemned. Be consoled by the reflection that your husband and brothers will atone for your father's conduct." In regard to Cook's decision to stay with the United States, Stuart said he will regret it but once, and that will be continually. To take the matter further, Jeb's son was named Philip St. George Cook Stuart. After reflection, he decided that his son's name should be changed. He couldn't stand to have his son named after a traitor. Jeb asked Flora to choose the child's new name, and it became James Ewell Brown Stuart, Jr., and the family would call him Jimmy. Jeb wanted to meet his father-in-law in battle. When a Union officer taken prisoner by Stuart's men told Jeb about his father-in-law whipping the Union horsemen into shape, Jeb responded, "I know he has a command, and I propose to take him prisoner. I married his daughter, and I want to present her with her father, so let him come on." Stuart took his role in the war seriously, and he wouldn't let Flora come between him and his military duties. He warned her that if she came to his headquarters, there was a good chance she wouldn't see him. He closely monitored the scarlet fever, measles, and mumps epidemics in the camp, and wouldn't allow Flora or the children to come if those broke out, as they inevitably did. In some instances, he simply discouraged her from coming, and when she asked for him to come to Richmond, he wrote back, "I don't care what other generals do. All I have to say is that while this war lasts, I will not leave the van of our army unless compelled to. Let that answer put to rest any hope of seeing me in Richmond." Through Stuart's letters, he dreamed about getting a home for the family, where Flora could make it her own, but only when the war was over. Throughout those same letters, Jeb recognized his own mortality, telling Flora to tell her son about his father if he should fall in battle. He truly believed that, bear in mind that if I fall, I'll leave in the sacrifice thus made a legacy more to be prized by my children and you dearest than 10 years of longer life. He wrote to a fellow Confederate that, I regard it as a foregone conclusion that we shall ultimately whip the Yankees. We are bound to believe that anyhow. But the war is going to be a long and terrible one first. We've only just begun it, and very few of us will see the end. Following in that fatalistic mindset, Stuart took out a $10,000 insurance policy on himself in November 1861, so that in the event of his death, his family would be taken care of. On December 20th, 1861, Stuart led a group of cavalry, artillery, and a brigade of infantry on an expedition to Drainesville to protect foraging parties in the area. Union forces that outnumbered Stuart about 2 to 1 got to the town first and took up a defensive position. Federal artillery exacted an incredible toll on Stuart's artillery, horses, and infantry, so much so that he pulled his smaller force away from the battle to regroup. Amidst the chaos of the affair at Drainesville, Stuart, probably going off instincts of being a quartermaster, personally took the harnesses off of the dead horses, saving government property from falling into the hands of the enemy. The next day, Stuart returned to Drainesville with reinforcements, but the enemy had left. Confederate forces gathered their wounded and buried their dead. Although the battle ended in a defeat for Stuart, it was a success because he halted the Union advance and protected the Confederate Army foragers operating just a short distance away. Through the winter, Stuart's command grew to 2,200 men, but was expected to protect a front over 50 miles wide. The lack of manpower resulted in some Federal horsemen penetrating the picket lines, but for the most part, Stuart successfully guarded Johnston's army and obtained valuable information about the Union Army now under George B. McClellan. Daniel Harvey Hill, an infantry commander, complained about Stuart's performance to President Jefferson Davis, and Davis wrote to Johnston suggesting that Stuart may not be the person for the job, but Johnston had full faith in Stuart and kept him on as cavalry commander. McClellan began maneuvering his army in what would become the Peninsula Campaign. Johnston, unsure about where the enemy army would move, pulled back to Culpeper Courthouse and waited, evacuating Manassas. Jeb's role as cavalry commander, guarding the withdrawal of Johnston's army, was to burn what supplies couldn't be brought with the army. Stuart's men set fire to piles of bacon taller than houses to destroy it. The smell of frying bacon could be smelt 20 miles away. They destroyed other supplies as well, and in just a few days, Union forces captured Manassas. McClellan began landing his army, numbering over 100,000 men on the peninsula formed by the York and James rivers. Johnston moved his army to the peninsula, but didn't like the idea of fighting on McClellan's terms. A lack of confidence in his defensive line led Johnston to decide to pull back, and Stuart acted as the rear guard again. At one point, the Union Army nearly surrounded Stuart, and he extricated himself and his command by riding south to the James River and using the beach as a sandy road to safety. The terrain didn't lend itself to cavalry tactics, so Stuart attached himself to Division Commander James Longstreet and ran his errands when not needed in his cavalry capacity. As Johnston retreated up the peninsula, Jeb continued to guard the army's rear. Now McClellan was approaching Richmond, threatening the capital. Johnston now needed to act. Heavy rains washed away bridges and resulted in 2 of McClellan's corps being isolated. Johnston decided it was time to attack and hopefully destroy one or both of those corps before McClellan could come to their rescue. What resulted was the Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks. The battle ended in basically a bloody standoff, but a casualty in the battle would change the war in the Eastern Theater. Johnston would be seriously wounded, and Davis replaced him with Stuart's former mentor and superintendent at West Point, Robert E. Lee.